The little black girl knocked at the airport office, crying that someone confiscated her family papers. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. It was late in the afternoon, the airport terminal buzzing with the usual crowd of passengers rushing to catch their flights. In the midst of it all, a little girl, no more than 8 years old, was running down the hallway, her tiny footsteps echoing off the cold tile floor. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. Her heart was pounding, and every breath she took felt like it was cutting through her chest. She didn't know what to do. She just knew she had to find someone who would help. She burst into the airport office, her voice shaky as she cried, "Please, someone took my family's papers." The office, which had been full of the usual humdrum of travel bookings and inquiries, went silent. The workers at the counter looked at each other in confusion, unsure of how to respond to the frantic little girl standing before them. The clerk at the front desk, a woman in her late 30s with a tired expression, leaned forward. "Sweetheart, what happened?" she asked, trying to soothe the girl. The little girl took a deep breath, her voice quivering as she explained, "My mom and dad. They were going to leave for a new life, but someone took all of our papers. The passport, the visas, everything. They said we couldn't leave." Her sobs became uncontrollable as she clutched her hands to her chest. The woman behind the desk didn't know what to make of it. She had seen many upset travelers, but nothing like this. She glanced over to her colleague, who simply shrugged, clearly unsure how to proceed. The little girl's words didn't seem to register at first. It was only when she mentioned the papers being taken that a flicker of recognition crossed the clerk's face. She knew what this could mean. She had heard rumors of situations like this before. Families being stopped at the airport, their documents mysteriously disappearing, leaving them stranded and helpless. But who would do something like this to a little girl? And why? Without much thought, the clerk nodded and signaled for the girl to sit down. "Stay here for a moment. I'm going to get someone to help you," she said, trying to remain calm, though the pit in her stomach grew heavier with every passing second. The little girl collapsed into the chair, her sobs quieting down, but her eyes still wide with fear. Outside the office, the air felt thick with tension as the clerk made a call to security. Something wasn't right, and it was clear that this wasn't just an innocent mistake. The girl's family had been targeted. But by whom? And why? As the security officer entered the room, the little girl's gaze snapped to him, desperate for a solution. "Please help us. We just want to leave," she whispered. The officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded gravely. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he assured her. But the question remained. Who had taken their papers? And more importantly, why? The mystery of the confiscated documents was only beginning to unfold. The little girl sat quietly in the chair, her small body trembling with fear. Her eyes were red from crying, and she stared at the floor, barely aware of the sounds around her. The airport office was unusually quiet now, the only noise coming from the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The clerk had walked off to make the call, and the security officer was speaking with a colleague at the far end of the room. The little girl's heart was racing, but her mind kept drifting back to the terrible moment when their papers were taken. She remembered her mother's frightened face when they were stopped at security. She could still hear the officer's cold voice telling them their documents were no longer valid, without explanation. Her father had tried to argue, but the officer had dismissed him, coldly pointing out that they had no right to leave. Her mother had clutched her hand, her grip tight as she pulled her away from the scene. "It's going to be okay," her mother had whispered, but the fear in her eyes told a different story. Now, sitting in this airport office, the little girl couldn't stop thinking about the dark thoughts creeping into her mind. What was happening? Who had taken their papers, and why? Was it because they didn't belong here? Were they being punished? The silence in the room was suffocating, but the sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. The security officer approached her, his face softening slightly as he knelt down to her level. "We're going to figure this out," he assured her. He looked around the room and then back at the girl. "Can you tell me exactly what happened when they took your family's papers?" The girl looked up, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back the tears. She nodded slowly and began to explain in a shaky voice. They said it wasn't right. That something was wrong with our papers. My mom and dad, they kept saying we had everything, but the man at security said it wasn't enough. He took everything from us, and now we can't leave. The officer listened intently, taking mental notes. He glanced at the desk, where the clerk had returned. He could see that the situation was more complicated than it seemed. He stood up, his brow furrowing. Stay here, he said to the girl, his voice firm but kind. We're going to find out what's going on. The officer walked over to the clerk and began speaking to her in hushed tones. Meanwhile, the little girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still holding tightly to the crumpled paper in her hand. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the weight of it all. The feeling that something was terribly wrong, that something bigger than her family was at play. The officer returned a few minutes later. I've spoken with the higher-ups, he said. They're going to get to the bottom of this. But there's something we need to consider. You mentioned your family's papers were taken. Was it by airport security? The girl nodded quickly. Yes, sir. By a man. He said they weren't valid, but he wouldn't explain why. The officer's face grew more serious as he glanced at the clerk, who was now on the phone, speaking in rapid Spanish. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, and he could feel it in his gut. All right, he said, his voice low. We're going to handle this carefully. I'm going to get your parents here so we can sort this out. Don't worry, okay? The girl nodded, but she wasn't reassured. The officer stepped out of the office to make another call, and the little girl was left alone, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how, but she had the feeling that everything was about to change. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. She glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. Just then, the office doors swung open again. A man walked in, his face cold and unreadable. He was dressed in a dark suit and tie, the same uniform she had seen on the man who had taken their papers. The officer returned to the room a moment later, introducing the man as the airport's head of security. The man nodded politely, but there was no warmth in his demeanor. He looked directly at the little girl, his eyes scanning her face before turning to the officer. We've been investigating the situation, he said. It seems your family's papers were flagged. It's a standard procedure. We have to make sure everything is legitimate before allowing people to travel. The little girl's heart sank. She had heard that word before. Flagged. Was it really just a mistake? Or was something more sinister at play? The man continued, his voice growing more authoritative. We will get your family's papers back, but first, we need to verify everything. It might take some time. The little girl felt her stomach twist. This wasn't a mistake. Something wasn't right. What do you mean by verify? She asked, her voice small. The man looked at her coldly. It means we need to make sure your family belongs here. And until we get those answers, we can't let them go. The little girl's breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand. Why was this happening to them? And why were they being treated like this? She just wanted to go home, to be with her family, to leave this place behind. But the more the man spoke, the more she realized that they were trapped. Nothing was going to be simple. Nothing was going to be easy. The little girl sat in silence, her small hands wringing the crumpled paper she still held tightly. The airport office now felt even colder than before, and the quiet buzz of overhead lights only amplified the tense stillness in the room. She was trying her best to stay calm, but the words the airport security officer had spoken kept replaying in her mind. We need to make sure your family belongs here. She didn't fully understand what that meant, but her heart was heavy with dread. What did they mean by belonging? Why were they making things so complicated when her family had all the right documents? She was just a little girl, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was going wrong. The officer had promised that they were going to sort things out, but how long would it take? And what was really going on? Was it just a mistake, or was there something else? The door to the office swung open again, breaking her thoughts. A tall man with a stern expression walked in, his black suit and tie making him look like someone important. He glanced at the little girl before turning his attention to the security officer. The officer gave a nod of acknowledgement and motioned toward the girl. This is the child who reported the issue with her family's documents, he said. The man, who had not yet spoken, glanced down at the girl, his gaze cold and indifferent. I understand, he said, his voice flat. He turned to the officer. What's the status on the family's papers? The officer shifted uncomfortably. We're still waiting on confirmation. The documents were flagged for review. We're not sure why, but it's clear that this wasn't just a routine check. Something is off. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the girl. The tension in the room thickened, and the little girl instinctively shrunk back into her chair, feeling more and more like an outsider in the very place that was supposed to be a gateway to their new life. She didn't understand why they were being treated like this, like they didn't belong. She had seen her family's passports and visas. They had all the right papers, just like anyone else. What was wrong with her family? The man finally spoke again, his tone hardening. Find out what's going on. Make sure this doesn't drag on. He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. The officer turned back to the little girl, his expression now more concerned than before. We're going to figure this out, okay? He said softly. Just stay with me for a little while longer. The little girl nodded, but her heart was still racing. She didn't know how long she could sit here, waiting for answers. What was happening to her family? Why were they being treated like criminals? And why did the officer keep saying figure this out, when nothing made sense? As the minutes dragged on, she began to wonder if they would ever be allowed to leave. The office door opened again, this time with a louder bang. A woman in a professional outfit walked in, carrying a large folder. She looked directly at the officer and then at the little girl. I'm Elena Vargas, she said, introducing herself. I'm with social services here. I've been briefed on the situation. We'll take care of this, but I need to speak with your parents first. The little girl felt a surge of hope. Social services. Maybe they could help. She nodded eagerly. Are you going to help us? Are we going to be able to leave soon? Elena smiled gently, but the little girl noticed a faint sadness in her eyes. We'll do everything we can, she said softly. But we need to make sure everything is in order first. There's been a mix-up, but we'll get to the bottom of it. As the woman spoke, the little girl's hope began to fade a little. Another mix-up. She had heard that word too many times already. It felt like the world was closing in on her, and no one was listening. They all kept saying it was just a mistake, but she knew it wasn't. Nothing about this felt like a mistake. As Elena spoke with the officer, the little girl's thoughts raced. Was this just another case of someone targeting her family because of the way they looked? Was it because they were immigrants trying to build a new life in this country? Was this the price they had to pay? For the first time in a long while, she felt completely powerless. She had no control over what was happening, and no one seemed to care enough to make it stop. Minutes turned to hours, and still, the little girl was no closer to finding out what was going on. She had no idea when she would see her parents again. She tried to stay strong, to hold back the tears, but it was getting harder. All she wanted was to go home with her family, to feel safe and loved. But that seemed farther away than ever. The door opened again, and another officer walked in, his expression grave. We've got a problem, he said. Elena looked up, a frown creasing her forehead. What's going on? The officer hesitated before speaking again. The family's papers, they've been flagged by higher authorities. It seems they're part of a larger investigation. The little girl's heart skipped a beat. An investigation? What did that even mean? She felt the weight of the words pressing down on her, suffocating her. The officer's words hung in the air like a thick cloud, and the little girl felt the ground beneath her feet start to slip away. She couldn't keep up with the rapid turn of events. She was scared, lost, and alone in a place that was supposed to protect her. Her world was quickly unraveling, and there was no one who seemed to know how to fix it. The officer's words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything felt like it was slowing down. The little girl's heart raced as she tried to understand what was happening. An investigation? Higher authorities? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. She had no idea what it meant for her family, and the uncertainty was consuming her. She looked around the room, but the faces of the adults seemed distant, focused on things she couldn't grasp. Elena's face had hardened, her eyes narrowing as she processed the officer's report. What kind of investigation are we talking about? She asked, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. The officer glanced at his colleague before responding. I don't have all the details yet, but it seems like they're looking into immigration fraud. This isn't just about the papers. It's part of a larger operation. The little girl felt a chill run down her spine. Immigration fraud? She had heard the term before, but she had never thought it would apply to her family. Her mother and father had always done everything by the book. They had worked hard, paid their taxes, and followed the rules. So why were they being dragged into something like this? She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but her throat felt tight. The fear had become too much. All she could do was sit there, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of words she didn't understand. Elena, seeing the distress on the little girl's face, turned to her with a soft expression. "Hey, it's going to be okay," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. "We'll figure this out. Just stay calm." But the little girl couldn't stay calm. The world around her was crumbling, and she didn't know who to trust anymore. The officer continued speaking, but his words barely reached her. "We'll need to detain the family for further questioning," he said, making the little girl snap her head up. Detain them? She felt the panic rise in her chest. No, they couldn't detain her family. They couldn't take her parents away. "No," she cried out, her voice breaking through the tension. "Please, don't take them. My mom and dad haven't done anything wrong." The officer looked at her, his expression hard but not unkind. "I know you're scared, but we have to follow the process. We're not trying to hurt anyone, but we need to make sure everything is in order." Elena stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the little girl's shoulder. "Listen," she said, her tone soft and reassuring. "We'll get them back as soon as we can. It's just a precaution, okay?" But the little girl could barely hear her. All she could hear was the word detain ringing in her ears. Her parents, who had promised to keep her safe, were now caught in something that threatened to tear them apart. Her vision blurred with tears, and her mind raced with all the worst-case scenarios. What if they were never allowed to leave? What if they were sent back? What if they were locked away forever? Her world, which had once been full of hope, now felt small and suffocating. The officer turned to leave the room, speaking into his radio. "We'll need backup. The family's being held for further questioning." Elena stayed behind, giving the little girl a reassuring smile. "I'm going to make sure you're okay," she said, though there was uncertainty in her voice. "Just stay with me. We'll get this sorted." The little girl wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that everything would be fine, that this was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she felt the weight of something much darker. They weren't just dealing with paperwork. This was something bigger, something that could change their lives forever. Minutes felt like hours as the little girl sat there, trying to hold it together. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been almost 2 hours since she had walked into this office. The longer they waited, the more her anxiety grew. She could feel the heaviness of the situation, the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't know how much longer she could wait. Just then, Elena returned with a somber look on her face. "We're still working on it," she said, but her eyes told a different story. The little girl could see it in the way Elena's shoulders were slumped, the way her jaw was clenched. Elena was worried too. "Is my family coming back soon?" the little girl asked, her voice trembling. Elena hesitated, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "We're doing everything we can. But right now, we have to wait for clearance from higher authorities. I know this isn't easy, but you need to trust me." The little girl nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could trust anyone anymore. The words higher authorities echoed in her mind. They had always told her that if she followed the rules, everything would be fine. But now, it felt like the rules were being used against her. She didn't understand why this was happening, and she didn't know how to make it stop. Outside the office, she could hear voices, the low murmur of people discussing her family's situation. There was a part of her that wanted to run, to escape the fear and the uncertainty, but she knew that wasn't an option. She had to stay. She had to hold on to the hope that somehow, her family would be released, and everything would go back to normal. But with every passing minute, that hope felt farther and farther away. As the night wore on, the tension in the room thickened. The little girl's stomach growled, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. She was too scared, too anxious about what might happen next. She sat silently, her mind racing, while Elena continued to make calls and try to get answers. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, the hours bleeding into one another. Finally, the door opened again. The officer stepped back in, his face grim. "We've got a situation," he said. Elena looked up, her expression tight. "What do you mean?" she asked, already knowing the answer wasn't going to be good. "The investigation's more serious than we thought," the officer said. "Your family's papers aren't just flagged. They've been reported as part of an ongoing case." The little girl's heart sank. It wasn't a mistake. This was real, and she had no idea how deep it went. The officer's words hit the little girl like a heavy weight. "Ongoing case?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart raced faster, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had heard those words before on the news, words that meant something serious, something out of her control. An ongoing case. What did that mean for her family? Were they in danger? The officer's face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a hint of sympathy that made the little girl feel even more uneasy. Elena stood beside her, her expression tense. What do you mean by ongoing case? She asked, her voice sharp. The officer shifted uncomfortably. I can't give you all the details, but it involves more than just the paperwork. It's part of a larger investigation, one that has implications for immigration fraud and possibly illegal activity. Your family's documents have been flagged as part of that investigation. The little girl's world tilted. Immigration fraud? Her family had been honest. They had come to this country with hopes and dreams, not to break the law. She clutched the crumpled paper in her hands, her fingers trembling. But we didn't do anything wrong, she choked out, tears brimming in her eyes. Elena bent down to her, her voice soft but firm. I know, sweetie. I know. But sometimes, things aren't as simple as they seem. We just have to trust that they'll figure it out. The little girl didn't feel reassured. She could barely process the words the officer had just said. All she wanted was to go home, to feel safe with her family. But now, everything was uncertain. The officer turned to leave the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Elena remained with the little girl, her expression hardening. I'm going to make some calls, she said, her voice steady. But the worry in her eyes was undeniable. As Elena left, the little girl was left alone, her thoughts a whirlwind. What was going to happen to her family? Why had their papers been flagged in the first place? She didn't understand it. They had done everything by the book. They had followed the rules. But now, it seemed like everything was falling apart. Time seemed to stretch on forever as she sat there, her hands clutched tightly around the crumpled paper. She could hear the faint sound of conversations in the hallway, but it all felt distant, like she was in a bubble, trapped in a world that didn't make sense. What had started as an innocent trip had quickly turned into something she couldn't escape from. And the worst part was that she had no control over it. After what felt like an eternity, Elena returned, her face set in determination. I've spoken with the head of immigration services, she said, her voice clipped. They're sending a team to investigate further. But it's going to take time. The little girl's heart sank. Time? How much time? Was she supposed to just sit here and wait? How long? She asked, her voice small, almost pleading. Elena looked down at her, her eyes softening with pity. I don't know, but we'll make sure they know you and your family are not criminals. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise. The words barely comforted her. How could she wait when everything was so uncertain? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could do was sit there, feeling smaller and smaller with every passing minute. The door opened again, and this time, a man walked in, a tall man in a suit, his face grim and businesslike. He didn't look at the little girl at first, his attention focused on Elena. I'm Special Agent Marks, he said, his voice firm. I've been briefed on the situation. He turned his gaze toward the little girl. I understand you have some questions about your family's paperwork. She nodded, her throat tight. What's going to happen to us? Why were our papers taken? Special Agent Marks studied her for a moment before speaking. We're in the process of verifying everything. Right now, your family's documents have been flagged due to an ongoing investigation. But I want to assure you, we are not looking to cause trouble for families who are here legally. This is just a precaution. The little girl swallowed hard, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. So what happens now? She asked. We need to make sure everything is legitimate, Special Agent Marks explained. This may take time, but we will get it sorted out. In the meantime, you and your family are free to stay here while we do our checks. The little girl nodded slowly, but she still felt uneasy. So we just wait? She asked, her voice shaky. The agent nodded. For now, yes. But we'll keep you updated as we move forward. As the agent left, the little girl was once again left with Elena, who tried to offer a reassuring smile. We're doing everything we can, okay? Just try to stay calm. We're going to figure this out. But as the minutes ticked by, it felt like the world around her was spinning out of control. How could she stay calm when her family's future was hanging in the balance? All she wanted was to go home, to feel safe. But in this place, with all the uncertainty and the fear, Home felt like a distant memory. Her parents weren't here, and the only thing she had was the hope that everything would work out. But deep down, she wasn't sure if it would. She had no idea how much longer she could hold on to that hope. The room felt colder now. The minutes that had passed since Special Agent Marks left were heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on the little girl's shoulders. Elena had stepped out, leaving her alone again, her thoughts spiraling in a mix of confusion and fear. She kept replaying the conversation over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it all. Precaution. Flagged documents. Ongoing investigation. These words echoed in her head like a haunting refrain. Her heart raced with every second that ticked by, and she kept glancing toward the door, hoping someone would come with answers, but no one did. She wanted to scream, to demand that her family be released, that everything go back to normal. But deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. The worst part was the waiting. Sitting there, in a cold, unfamiliar office, with no idea what was happening outside, no idea what was going to happen next. Was her family going to be dragged into something they didn't even understand? Why were they being treated like criminals? Her thoughts were interrupted when Elena returned, her expression more somber than before. She had been making phone calls, working tirelessly to find answers, but it was clear that something was still wrong. She didn't look at the little girl at first, her gaze fixed on the ground as she entered the room. The little girl could tell by the way Elena's shoulders were slumped that the news wasn't good. Elena sighed, sitting down across from her. "They're not going to release your family right now," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The investigation is more complicated than we thought. Your documents are being checked at a higher level, and there's nothing we can do to speed it up." The little girl's heart sank. Her worst fears were becoming reality. Her family was being caught up in something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. She had known it wasn't just a simple mistake, but now it was confirmed. They were part of an investigation, and there was no way out. She squeezed the crumpled paper in her hands, her fingers trembling. "How long?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Elena's eyes softened, but there was nothing she could say to ease the little girl's pain. "I don't know. It could take days. Maybe longer." The little girl closed her eyes, trying to fight back the tears. How could this be happening? Why was it happening to them? She thought about her mother's smile, her father's comforting presence, and how they had always promised to protect her. They had come to this country to build a better life, to escape the hardships they had faced before. But now, they were trapped in a nightmare. Elena reached out and gently placed a hand on the little girl's arm. "I know this is hard, but you need to stay strong," she said, her voice sincere. "Your parents are going to need you to be strong when they get back, and we're doing everything we can to help you." But the little girl didn't feel strong. She felt like everything she had known, everything she had trusted, was crumbling around her. "But what if they don't come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elena's face hardened with resolve. "They will. We're going to make sure of it." The little girl nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed her. The fear that had settled in her chest was too much to ignore. As the silence stretched on, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her even more. The minutes felt like hours, and each second that passed without any answers only deepened her sense of helplessness. The door to the office opened again, and the officer from earlier stepped inside. His face was serious, and there was a look in his eyes that made the little girl's heart skip a beat. "I've got some updates," he said, his tone somber. The little girl's breath caught in her throat. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. The officer glanced at Elena before speaking again. "Your family's situation is complicated," he said. "We found some inconsistencies in the documents. We're doing everything we can to sort it out, but right now, it's going to take time. The investigation needs to be thorough, and we can't let anyone go until it's completed." Elena stood up, her expression hardening. "What does that mean for them? Are you saying you're going to keep them here indefinitely?" The officer's face remained impassive. "I can't say for certain, but for now, they're being detained for questioning. Once we have all the information, we'll know what to do next." The little girl felt like the floor was slipping out from under her. Detained? Her family wasn't even being allowed to leave. They were being treated like criminals, and she didn't know how to stop it. She wanted to run, to find her parents and scream at them to come back, to take her home. But she was stuck here, alone and powerless. The officer turned to leave, but before he could walk out the door, he paused. I know this is difficult, he said, his voice softening slightly. But please, try to understand. We're just doing our job. The little girl didn't know how to respond. How could she understand? How could she accept this nightmare? Elena's voice broke through her thoughts. Don't worry. We'll stay in touch. I won't let anything happen to your family. I promise. But even with her words of reassurance, the little girl couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. The officers were in control now, and they were the ones deciding her family's fate. There was nothing she could do to change it. As the officer left, the room felt colder, emptier. Elena gave the little girl a final look before turning to make another call. The little girl sat in the chair, feeling more alone than she ever had before. Time dragged on, and all she could do was wait, hope, and pray that somehow, against all odds, her family would be able to leave this nightmare behind. The room felt even colder now, the silence settling in like a heavy fog. The little girl could hardly breathe, her chest tightening with every passing second. She had been waiting for what felt like forever, her thoughts spinning in endless circles. The officer had left, and Elena was on another call, her voice barely audible as she tried to get updates from the higher-ups. The little girl's mind kept drifting back to the words detained, investigation, and higher authorities. Nothing made sense. Why had their family been caught up in something like this? Why were they being treated like criminals when they had followed all the rules? The fear and uncertainty were overwhelming, and all she could do was sit there, clutching the crumpled paper in her hands as if it could somehow protect her. It had been hours since she last saw her parents. She hadn't even been able to speak to them. What were they going through right now? Were they as scared as she was? The thought of them being locked away somewhere made her stomach twist with dread. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating her. How could she stay strong when everything she cared about was falling apart? She wanted to scream, to beg for answers, but the fear in her heart kept her silent. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was powerless in this situation. The door opened again, and this time, it was a different officer. He was tall and serious-looking, his expression hard and unreadable. He glanced at the little girl, then at Elena, who was still on the phone, pacing back and forth. "We've made some progress," the officer said, his voice clipped. "Your family's situation is still under investigation, but we've been able to make contact with their legal representatives." The little girl's heart skipped a beat. Legal representatives? Was that a good sign? Or did it mean something worse? "What does that mean?" Elena asked, her voice cautious but hopeful. "It means that we're no longer handling this internally," the officer replied. "The case has been escalated to federal authorities. They're now taking over the investigation." The little girl's head spun. Federal authorities? Was that good or bad? What did it mean for her family? She wanted to ask, but the words stuck in her throat. The officer seemed to notice the look of confusion and fear in her eyes, and for the first time, his expression softened slightly. "It's just a formality," he explained. "Once federal authorities are involved, they'll ensure that everything is handled properly. It doesn't mean your family has done anything wrong. It's just part of the process." The little girl wasn't sure she believed him. Everything felt wrong. They had done nothing wrong. Why was this happening? "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The officer sighed and glanced at Elena before answering. "Now we wait. We're working with the federal team to get everything sorted. They'll contact you once they have all the information they need." The little girl wanted to scream again. Wait. How long? She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't sit here, waiting, not knowing what was happening to her family. "But what if they don't come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if they don't get the papers back? What if they never let us go?" The officer's expression hardened again, and he straightened up. "We're doing everything we can to make sure they get their papers back. The investigation is just a precaution. Your family hasn't been accused of anything criminal." But the little girl didn't feel reassured. She had heard that word before, precaution, and it had never made her feel safe. She had a terrible feeling that things were much worse than they were letting on. "We're doing everything we can," the officer said again, as if repeating the same words would make them true. "But for now, you need to stay calm and trust the process." The little girl wanted to shout, to tell him she couldn't trust the process. She couldn't trust any of this. She had never felt so helpless in her life. As the officer turned to leave, Elena finally finished her call and walked over to the little girl. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice softer than before. The little girl didn't answer. She couldn't answer. There were no words to describe how she was feeling. Nothing could express the fear and uncertainty swirling inside her. She wanted to go home, to be with her family, to feel safe again. But that was looking less and less likely. Elena knelt down beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Listen," she said softly, "I know this is hard, but we're going to get through this. We just need to stay strong and trust that everything will work out." But the little girl didn't feel strong. She didn't feel like anything would work out. She felt like her world was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Outside the office, she could hear the sounds of people talking, the murmur of voices mixed with the sound of footsteps. She wondered what was happening out there. What were they saying about her family? Were they talking about them like criminals? The uncertainty was maddening. The minutes dragged on, and each one felt like an eternity. Finally, after what felt like forever, Elena stood up. "I'm going to get some answers," she said. "Stay here, and I'll check in with the officers. I won't let anything happen to your family." The little girl nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed her. Elena walked out, leaving the little girl alone once again. She sat there in the silence, her thoughts racing. The waiting was unbearable. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on to hope. What if her family was stuck here forever? What if they never made it out? The fear was overwhelming, and she had no answers, only questions. All she could do was wait and pray that someone, anyone, would finally come with good news. Hours passed, and the little girl's mind seemed to be spinning faster than the clock on the wall. The sounds of voices in the hallway were a constant reminder that something was happening, but no one came to give her answers. The officer had left earlier, and Elena was still making calls, trying to get updates. But it felt like the world outside was moving on while she remained stuck in a small, sterile office. The fear that had been building inside her since this nightmare began was now a tight knot in her stomach. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The waiting was unbearable. What were they doing to her family? Were they even safe? The little girl clutched the crumpled paper tighter in her hands, as though it could offer some comfort, but all it did was remind her of how helpless she felt. She wanted to scream, to ask someone, anyone, to tell her that everything would be okay, but no one had the answers. The door opened suddenly, and Elena walked in. Her face was tired, and there was a look of determination in her eyes, but there was also something else. "Worry. We've got some news," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. The little girl's heart jumped at the words, but she didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. "Is it good news?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena took a deep breath before speaking again. "It's complicated," she said slowly. "The investigation is ongoing, but we've managed to get in touch with your family's lawyer. They're working on it, but the process is slow." The little girl felt a wave of frustration. "How slow?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and impatience. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "But they're doing everything they can. The situation is more complex than anyone realized. There are other families involved, and they're trying to piece everything together." The little girl's stomach churned. "But why us?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why is this happening to us?" Elena paused, her gaze softening. She kneeled down next to the little girl, her hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I wish I could give you the answers you need," she said softly. "But sometimes, things happen that we don't understand. All we can do is trust the process and hope that things work out. I know it's hard, but your family isn't alone in this. We're here for you." The little girl nodded, but the words felt hollow. She didn't want to hear about processes or hope. She wanted her family back. She wanted to go home. She wanted this nightmare to end. As Elena stood up, the little girl looked at her, her heart heavy with doubt. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elena hesitated, her expression faltering for just a moment. "I believe they will," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But we have to wait. I know it's hard, but they're not giving up, and neither should you." The little girl tried to hold back the tears, but it was impossible. The fear and the uncertainty had been too much for her to handle. She had been strong for so long, but now it felt like she was at the edge, ready to fall apart. Elena seemed to sense her struggle. "Hey," she said gently, her voice reassuring. "You're not alone. We're here for you. Your family is going to get through this. You just have to stay strong a little longer." The little girl nodded, wiping her eyes, but she didn't feel strong. She felt small, alone, and powerless. The uncertainty weighed on her, and she had no idea when it would end. She glanced at the clock again, the minutes dragging on, but still no answers. Still no sign of her family. Every second that passed felt like a lost opportunity. Would they ever be free? Would her family ever come back to her? The door opened again, and this time, it was the officer from earlier. His face was even more serious than before, and he didn't look at the little girl immediately. He turned to Elena. "We've hit another roadblock," he said, his voice tense. Elena's face fell. "What happened?" she asked, her concern evident. The officer paused, his eyes flicking toward the little girl for a brief moment before speaking. "The documents are still being processed, but it looks like there's been a delay with the legal team. They're trying to verify the information, but it's going to take more time." The little girl's heart sank. More time. It felt like a cruel joke. How much longer could they keep her family here, locked away from her? "How much more time?" Elena asked, her voice growing sharper. The officer didn't have an immediate answer. He simply shrugged. "We're doing everything we can. The investigation is being handled by the federal authorities, and they don't move quickly. But we'll keep pushing. I'll let you know if there's any change." The little girl's thoughts spun, the words barely sinking in. Federal authorities. Time. Delays. She couldn't process it all. She just wanted to be with her family again. "What if they never come back?" she asked again, her voice cracking. The officer's expression softened, but there was little reassurance in his words. "They will," he said, though it didn't sound convincing. "Just hold on a little longer." As the officer turned to leave, the little girl felt a rush of helplessness wash over her. How much longer could she hold on? How long would this nightmare last? She didn't have any answers, and she wasn't sure if she could wait much longer. Elena placed a hand on her shoulder once more. "I know it's hard, but we'll get through this together. I promise." But the little girl couldn't bring herself to believe her. It was hard to believe anything anymore. The uncertainty was suffocating, and all she wanted was her family back. Just then, she heard footsteps outside the door, but they were distant, fading away, just like the hope she had been holding on to. Was this the beginning of the end? Or was this just another test she had to survive? Only time would tell. The little girl sat in the same chair, the room feeling colder with every passing minute. The weight of uncertainty was pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Every hour that ticked by, without any word from her parents, made it harder to stay calm. She had barely slept, her thoughts constantly racing. Elena had been coming in and out of the office, making phone calls, talking to the officers, but nothing seemed to change. Every time the little girl asked how much longer they would have to wait, the answer was always the same: "We don't know." The door opened once more, and Elena stepped in, her expression more serious than usual. The little girl looked up, her heart sinking at the look on her face. Elena didn't immediately speak, but the silence between them spoke volumes. "What happened?" the little girl asked, her voice cracking. Elena took a deep breath before sitting down beside her. "There's some new information," she said slowly. "The investigation is deeper than we thought." The little girl's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Your family's papers aren't just part of a routine check. It looks like they're being tied to a larger operation, something bigger than just your case." The little girl's mind reeled. A larger operation? What did that mean for her family? She had no idea what to think anymore. "But they didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "They're good people. They just want to be here, like everyone else. Why are they being treated like criminals?" Elena's face softened, but her eyes betrayed the seriousness of the situation. I know. But sometimes, things get tangled up, and the system doesn't always work the way we want it to. Right now, your family's caught up in something that's out of our hands." The little girl felt tears welling up in her eyes again. "What does that mean for us? What's going to happen to my parents?" Elena didn't answer right away. She sat there, her face unreadable, before finally speaking. "I don't know yet. But we're doing everything we can to help them. We're not going to leave them hanging." The little girl swallowed hard, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to spill over. "But I want them back. I want them to come home," she whispered, her voice breaking. Elena reached over, placing a hand on the little girl's arm in a gesture of comfort. "I promise we're doing everything possible to bring them home," she said softly. "But right now, All we can do is wait. The authorities are working on it, and they'll let us know as soon as there's an update. The little girl didn't know if she could wait anymore. Every minute without her family felt like an eternity. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all too much. She had never felt so alone. As if reading her mind, Elena added, I know it's hard, but you have to stay strong. You're doing great. Your family will be so proud of how brave you're being. But the little girl wasn't sure if she was being brave. She felt anything but brave. She just felt small, powerless, and terrified. The minutes dragged on in a painful silence, and the little girl couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. Why? Had their documents been flagged? What was the bigger operation that her family was now a part of? Were they being treated like criminals because of something they had no control over? Every question only led to more questions. The door opened again, and this time, it was the officer who had been handling her family's case. His face was grim, and there was a look of concern in his eyes as he stepped inside. We've got some new developments, he said, his voice low. The little girl felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. The officer glanced at Elena before responding. It's not just your family's documents. We've uncovered some connections between the papers and a larger network. The investigation is getting more complicated, and I'm afraid it's going to take even longer to resolve. The little girl felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. What network? What are you talking about? She asked, her voice rising with fear. The officer hesitated, clearly not wanting to add to the little girl's anxiety. I can't go into details, he said. But the investigation is now involving more people than we initially thought. Your family's situation has become part of something much bigger. We're working as quickly as we can to clear this up, but it's going to take time. The little girl's heart sank. More people? Bigger network? It felt like everything she thought she knew was being ripped away from her. How could this happen to them? They were just a family trying to live a better life. How much longer? She asked, her voice cracking as the tears finally came. The officer looked at her, his face softening with empathy. I don't know, he said honestly. We're doing everything we can to resolve this as quickly as possible, but right now, we need to let the process run its course. I wish I could give you a clear answer, but I don't have one. The little girl nodded slowly, her body trembling with emotion. She couldn't stay in this waiting room any longer. She needed answers. She needed her family back. As the officer left, Elena sat beside her again, her face filled with concern. I know this is unbearable, she said, her voice gentle. But I need you to hold on just a little longer. We're all doing everything we can to help you. The little girl nodded again, but her heart was heavy with doubt. How much longer could she hold on? How much longer could they keep her family locked away in a system that didn't care about their innocence? The uncertainty was suffocating, and she had no idea when it would all end. The little girl sat in the same chair, her back pressed against the cold, sterile wall of the office. She had lost track of how many hours had passed since the officer left with more bad news. The world outside the room felt like it was moving on, while she remained stuck in a never-ending loop of fear and uncertainty. Her mind raced with questions that had no answers. What was happening to her family? Why couldn't anyone give her a clear answer? The silence in the room felt suffocating, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She could still hear the murmurs of voices in the hallway, but they didn't bring her any comfort. If anything, they only reminded her of how alone she felt. She glanced at the clock on the wall, but the hands seemed to move slower than ever. She had lost track of time. How much longer would this drag on? Would they ever let her family go? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the door. She sat up straighter, her heart pounding in her chest. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was coming to tell her that everything was going to be okay. But when the door opened, it wasn't the officer or Elena. Instead, it was another man in a suit, someone she didn't recognize. He walked into the room with a purposeful stride, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the little girl, then turned his attention to Elena, who was sitting across from her. The man nodded curtly, his tone businesslike. I'm Special Agent Harrison, he introduced himself. I'm overseeing the investigation involving your family's documents. The little girl's heart skipped a beat. Another agent? Was this more bad news? She glanced at Elena, whose face had hardened in a way the little girl hadn't seen before. Elena nodded slowly. What's going on? She asked, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of concern. Special Agent Harrison turned to the little girl, his gaze softening for a brief moment. "We've made some progress," he said. "I know this situation has been stressful for you, but we're getting closer to resolving it." The little girl felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was fleeting. His words didn't sound as reassuring as she had hoped. "Closer to resolving it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What does that mean? Are my parents coming back soon?" Special Agent Harrison sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "I can't give you a specific timeline," he said, "but we're working with immigration authorities to clear up the situation. There have been complications, and there are still some details we need to confirm, but we're doing everything we can to expedite the process." The little girl's stomach churned. "Complications?" she repeated, her voice rising with anxiety. "What kind of complications? Why is this taking so long? My family did nothing wrong." Elena placed a hand on the little girl's arm, offering a small measure of comfort. "I know this is hard," Elena said softly, "but we need to stay patient. They're doing their best to get everything sorted out." The little girl wanted to scream. Patient? How could she be patient when her parents were locked away somewhere, and she didn't know when she would see them again? "You don't understand," the little girl whispered, her voice breaking. "They're my family. They're all I have. I just want to go home." Special Agent Harrison stood there, his expression unreadable. "I understand this is difficult for you," he said, his tone firm. "But the investigation needs to run its course. We're trying to get things moving as quickly as possible, but there are a lot of moving parts." He turned to Elena. "You'll be kept informed. We'll let you know as soon as we have more information." Elena nodded, though the little girl could see the worry in her eyes. Special Agent Harrison left as quickly as he came, his footsteps fading into the hallway. The little girl felt a surge of frustration. More waiting. More uncertainty. She didn't know how much longer she could keep doing this. She had no control over anything. All she could do was sit there, hoping for answers that never seemed to come. Elena gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice gentle. "Your family is going to come home. Just stay strong for a little while longer." The little girl nodded, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. She wanted to believe Elena, but the doubt gnawed at her. How could she stay strong when everything felt so wrong? How could she trust that this would end when she didn't even know what was going on? As the hours passed, she tried to distract herself, but the fear never left. She couldn't escape the thoughts of her parents, wondering if they were being treated the same way she was, caught in a system they couldn't understand, unable to fight back. What had happened to the world they had built? What happened to the safety and security they had promised her? With every passing minute, she felt more and more like she was losing everything. She couldn't see an end to it. And the worst part was, she had no idea how long this would last. It could be days, it could be weeks, and she had no control over it. Her family was trapped in the middle of something bigger than they could have imagined, and she didn't know how to get them out. The uncertainty was suffocating. All she could do was wait. Wait for news. Wait for something, anything, to change. But she didn't know if she could keep waiting much longer. Each moment felt like a lifetime, and the hope that had once kept her going was slowly fading away. The little girl sat in the cold, sterile office, the silence around her growing heavier with each passing minute. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, her mind racing with confusion, fear, and frustration. Every minute without news from her family felt like an eternity. Elena had stepped out to make another call, and the little girl was left alone with nothing but her thoughts. What was happening to her family? Why couldn't anyone just tell her what was going on? She had no control over the situation, and the uncertainty was starting to feel unbearable. As she sat there, her mind went back to the promise Elena had made earlier, that everything would work out. But with every passing hour, it seemed harder and harder to believe. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could do was sit quietly and wait. She thought about her parents, her mother, her father, and how they had always been there for her. Now, they were trapped in some kind of system that she didn't understand. What if they never came back? What if the investigation took so long that they were lost to her forever? Her hands shook as she clasped them together in her lap. She tried to focus on something else, anything to keep her mind from spiraling out of control. Just then, the door opened, and Elena stepped back into the room. The little girl quickly wiped away the tears that had started to fall. Elena looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Hey, I know this is tough, she said, sitting down beside her. But I need you to listen to me. We've got some new information. The little girl looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Is it about my family? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elena nodded. Yes. They're still holding your parents, but there's been a development. The little girl's chest tightened. What kind of development? Elena sighed, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I can't go into too much detail, but we've learned that your family's case is tied to something much bigger. Federal authorities are involved, and they're handling things from here on out. The little girl's mind raced. Federal authorities? What did that mean? What's going to happen to them? She asked, her voice trembling with fear. Elena looked at her, her expression softening. Right now, they're working to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. But the investigation is complicated. It's going to take time. The little girl's heart sank. How much time? She asked, her voice barely audible. Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I don't know, but I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to help your family. They're not forgotten. You're not forgotten. The little girl nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. I just want to go home, she whispered. Elena took her hand gently, her grip warm and reassuring. I know. I want that for you too. But we have to wait. The authorities are doing their part, and we need to give them the time they need to figure this out. It's not easy, I know. The little girl squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't want to wait anymore. Every minute felt like an hour, and every hour felt like a day. How much longer could she sit here, waiting, hoping, praying that her family would come back? How could she stay strong when everything seemed so uncertain? Elena stayed by her side, talking to the officers, making phone calls, trying to get answers. But every time the little girl asked for an update, the answer was always the same. It's still being processed. The waiting was becoming unbearable. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to see her parents. She needed to know that they were okay, that they hadn't been lost in some bureaucratic nightmare. She felt like she was losing everything. Her family, her sense of security, her entire world. The door to the office opened again, and the officer from earlier walked in. His face was stern, and he didn't look at the little girl at first. He spoke briefly with Elena before turning to her. We've got more news, he said, his voice low. The little girl looked up, her heart racing. What is it? She asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The officer hesitated, his face betraying a hint of concern. We've managed to speak with your family's lawyer, he said. They've confirmed that the situation is more complex than we thought. It's going to take longer to resolve, but we're doing everything we can to move things along. The little girl's breath caught in her throat. How long? She asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer looked at her, his expression softening. I can't give you a specific timeline, he said, his tone gentle. But I want you to know that we're working hard to get your family back to you. It's just going to take more time. Elena placed a hand on the little girl's shoulder, her touch grounding. I know this is hard, but you have to keep going. You're stronger than you think. The little girl nodded slowly, but her heart felt heavy. She couldn't understand why this was happening to them. She couldn't understand why her family was being kept from her. All she wanted was to go home. But the more she waited, the more it felt like home was slipping farther and farther away. As the officer left, Elena stayed with her, offering quiet words of reassurance, but none of it was enough. The little girl's thoughts raced as the silence between them stretched on. How much longer could they keep her family detained? How much longer would this nightmare last? Time seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, and she had no idea when, if, she would ever see her family again. The little girl sat motionless in the cold, empty room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The silence was deafening. It had been days since she had last seen her parents, and the pain of waiting had become almost unbearable. Every moment felt like an eternity, each one dragging on longer than the last. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Why were they still being detained? Why hadn't anyone told her when they would come back? Elena had tried to comfort her, telling her that the investigation would eventually be over and her family would be released, but the little girl could no longer believe in empty promises. Every passing day without her family felt like losing a piece of herself. The fear gnawed at her, the uncertainty eating away at her hope. What if they never came back? What if the investigation took months, or even years? What if they were never free again? She couldn't bear the thought. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each one more overwhelming than the last. She had tried to stay strong, to keep it together for her parents' sake, but it was getting harder with every passing hour. The door opened suddenly, and the little girl jumped, her heart pounding. It was Elena again, but her face was not the reassuring one the little girl had come to know. It was more guarded, more serious. The little girl felt a pit form in her stomach. She knew that look. It was the look people wore when there was bad news. "What's going on?" the little girl asked, her voice trembling. Elena walked over to her, her face softening just a little. "I need you to listen to me," she said gently, her voice low. "There's been an update. I know you've been waiting a long time, and I'm sorry for that. But we're getting closer to answers." The little girl swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Closer? What does that mean? Are they coming back?" Elena hesitated before speaking. "It means that the investigation is moving forward. But there's more we need to understand before we can clear things up. There are still some complications." The little girl's heart sank, the words feeling like a punch to the gut. Complications. She didn't want to hear that. "What complications?" she asked, barely able to keep the edge of panic out of her voice. Elena sighed deeply, sitting down beside her. "There are connections between your family's case and a larger issue that we didn't know about before. We're dealing with a much more complex situation than we thought. Federal authorities are involved now, and they're taking this very seriously." The little girl felt the weight of Elena's words crush her. Federal authorities? That sounded so much worse than anything she had imagined. "What do you mean? What's happening to my family?" Elena looked at her with sorrow in her eyes. "I can't give you all the details, but I promise you, your family is not being treated like criminals. This isn't about them breaking the law. It's about something bigger, something that they got caught up in." The little girl couldn't process what Elena was saying. The more she heard, the more it seemed like her family was stuck in something they couldn't control. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just trying to live a better life, and now, they were tangled up in something they couldn't escape. "When will they come back?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Elena placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "I don't know, sweetie," she said softly. "I know this is terrifying, but we have to trust that everything will work out. The authorities are doing their job, and they won't stop until everything is cleared up." The little girl wanted to believe her, but how could she? How could she trust the people who were keeping her family from her? The officers who kept saying, "We're doing everything we can," but never gave her any real answers. "Why is this happening?" she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "Why my family?" Elena paused before answering, her voice soft and full of sympathy. "I don't know, sweetheart. I wish I could tell you why, but sometimes things happen that we can't explain. We just have to keep going and hope that everything will be okay in the end." The little girl wiped her eyes, trying to hold herself together, but the tears wouldn't stop. She missed her parents so much. She missed their hugs, their reassuring voices, the way they made her feel safe. Without them, she felt lost, like she was floating in a world where nothing made sense. "What if they don't come back?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Elena gave her a soft, sad smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "They will," she said gently. "We're doing everything we can to make sure of it. But for now, we just have to be patient. I know it's hard, but we'll get through this." The little girl wanted to believe her, but the fear in her heart was too strong. How much longer could she keep waiting? How much longer could she endure this fear? As Elena left the room, the little girl was once again alone, her thoughts spiraling. She glanced at the clock, its ticking echoing in her mind. Hours had passed. Days had passed. How much longer would she have to sit here, waiting for her family to return? Would they ever come back? She didn't have any answers, only questions. All she could do was wait, and hope, and pray that somehow, some way, her family would come home. But with each passing hour, the doubt crept deeper into her heart. Would they? The days dragged on, and the little girl's sense of time had almost completely disappeared. She had been waiting for so long, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. The office, once so unfamiliar, had become the place where she spent the majority of her days, each passing hour only deepening her fear and uncertainty. Elena, though kind and reassuring, could only offer her words of comfort that no longer felt as comforting as before. The little girl was growing numb to the idea that things would get better or work out. She had stopped counting the hours, but she could feel the weight of every single second pressing down on her. Her parents were still missing, and all she had was the hope that someone, anyone, would finally come through with answers. It was late in the afternoon when Elena returned to the room, her face carrying a different expression than before. The usual calm was replaced with something else, something the little girl couldn't quite place. It was a look of urgency, of something important being about to happen. Elena closed the door quietly behind her, walking toward the little girl with a measured pace. The little girl's heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? Were they finally coming for her parents? Had they finally figured out the mess? I have news, Elena said softly, her voice trembling slightly. The little girl felt a surge of emotion, but she tried to stay calm. Is it good news? She whispered, her throat tight. Elena sat down next to her. It's not exactly what we hoped for, she said carefully. But it's something. The little girl's heart sank. What do you mean? Are they coming back? Elena exhaled slowly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The investigation is still ongoing, but the legal team has managed to get in touch with the higher authorities. There's been a breakthrough. They've confirmed that your family's documents are now cleared. The little girl's breath caught in her chest. Cleared? That sounded like something good, but it wasn't enough. What does that mean? Are they free now? She asked, her voice full of desperation. Elena paused for a moment, her eyes softening. Your family has been cleared of any wrongdoing. The investigation was more complicated than anyone realized, but the documents are valid. They were wrongfully flagged, and they've been cleared of suspicion. The little girl blinked in disbelief. So, they're coming back? They're not in trouble anymore. Elena nodded slowly. That's right. They're being released as we speak. It's going to take some time for them to process everything, but they're not being detained anymore. The little girl couldn't believe it. She had waited for so long, and now it seemed like the impossible was finally happening. She felt a rush of relief flood through her, but it was immediately mixed with the overwhelming exhaustion of the past days. Her parents were coming back. They were going to be okay. The weight she had been carrying for so long suddenly felt lighter. Can I see them now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena smiled warmly. Yes, sweetie. You can see them as soon as the paperwork is finished. They'll be here soon. The little girl's face lit up with a mixture of joy and disbelief. She couldn't wait to hold her parents again, to feel their warmth and know that they were safe. But as much as she wanted to run to them, she knew there was still one last hurdle to cross. The paperwork had to be processed. Will they be okay? She asked quietly, her voice trembling. Elena nodded. Yes, they're going to be fine. This was just a misunderstanding, and it's all cleared up now. The system made a mistake, but we're fixing it. The little girl smiled weakly, still not fully believing that this was real. But as Elena stood up and walked toward the door, she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. I'm going to go check in with the officers and make sure everything's on track, Elena said. I'll be right back. As Elena left, the little girl sat there for a moment, processing everything that had happened. For so long, she had felt lost, alone, and afraid. But now, everything was changing. Her parents were coming back, and she was going to be reunited with them. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all melting away, replaced by a feeling she had nearly forgotten, hope. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet world beyond. It had seemed like a lifetime since she had seen her family. But now, the thought of holding them again was enough to fill her heart with warmth. She couldn't wait to tell them everything that had happened. She couldn't wait to hear their voices again. The door opened again, and this time, it was the officer she had spoken to earlier. He smiled gently as he entered, and the little girl could see the relief in his eyes. It's done, he said simply. Your family is free to go. We've taken care of everything. They'll be released shortly, and you'll be able to see them. The little girl's heart skipped a beat. They're really coming back? She asked, her voice trembling with excitement. The officer nodded, his expression warm. Yes, you're going to be with them again very soon. The little girl's face broke into a smile, so wide it felt like it might tear her face in half. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now it was finally happening. She was going to see her parents. Again, and nothing in the world could take that away from her. She felt a sense of peace wash over her, the last of the fear dissolving in the light of the good news. The nightmare was over. Her family was coming home, and she would never have to feel alone again.